It's really lovely to be back here at CERIS, only a few months after I came in the winter to deliver my food security lecture, which I do pretty much every year here. I think it was February, and it was much cooler than it is today. So I'm here, and I wanted to broaden my thinking beyond food security to give you a bit of other reflections on the state of the world. But before that, I think the first thing to say really is to congratulate all of those who are graduating today, to your friends and family, all family members who've supported you through your journey. At my own institution, we have 8 graduation ceremonies every year, all held within the same week, also usually on a very hot week. And even though it's a lot of people, it's a lot of clapping for hundreds and hundreds of graduates, it's really one of my favorite times of year because it's such a culmination of a journey for all of you who have been carrying out your studies here. So really, congratulations. I was asked to speak for 30 minutes. You'll be pleased to know I probably won't go for 30 minutes, maybe more like 20, 25, given the heat. But to speak about a theme relating to your subject, my subject as well. And I thought that framing my remarks around the theme of rethinking development in the context of a changing global order would be useful because it allows us to kind of reflect on the world that you're entering now as you finish your studies here. Some of you I know have been working in the fields of diplomacy and international development while you've been carrying out your studies. So all the more congratulations to you to be managing both work and study at the same time. I know that's really difficult. And so you're familiar, though, with just how much things have been changing in the world and are changing. But perhaps it's useful to spend some time unpacking this idea of the state of the world to which you'll be applying your CERIS education after today. So you, or maybe more likely your family and friends, may be wondering whether this is actually the worst time ever to be entering or rejoining the fields of diplomacy and international development. Massive budget cuts in international development and foreign affairs in many countries has led to job cuts, program closures, cancellations of commitments on climate action, the Sustainable Development Goals, and global health targets. There's debate about whether we're entering a multipolar world or a unipolar world with China at the apex, or indeed whether, as Canadian Prime Minister Marc suggests, this is the moment for a form of middle states leadership. The rise of popularism and isolationism around the world is certainly not a new phenomenon. Those of you who were in my lecture in February will remember that I talked about food price spikes that happened in 2007, 8, and then again in 2010 and 11. And we looked at the ways in which all the kind of perfect storm of different kinds of factors came together, not only to generate increases in food and fuel prices, but to create essentially global economic recessions that then had their own dynamics. And so we unpack that in some ways. And when we look at those two different periods, and again, they're not the first, of course, to have these kind of dynamics, but they're two quite recent ones, we can see that they've often caused governments in wealthier countries and investors and citizens to turn inward and to focus on domestic challenges, the things that affect them in their lives more directly. They're concerned with the rising cost of living and shrinking incomes, with accessing services for themselves, and less concerned with whether those services are available to everyone else in the globe at the same kind of level or at even any kind of basic level. This sentiment fueled the vote in the UK to leave the European Union, which this week is celebrated. It's 10 years since the Brexit vote, 2 days ago. It was also exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, in which countries literally went into lockdown, closing their doors and their airspaces to movement and pulling financial resources away from international engagement in order to focus more on domestic challenges. In some ways, we haven't really ever fully recovered from the pandemic. International spending has not been restored to pre-COVID levels. Instead, it's been reduced even further. This might be somewhat surprising, since one of the major lessons of the pandemic is that threats in one part of the world can travel quickly to other parts of the world. Indeed, the World Health Organization's warning that no one is safe until we are all safe has been shown to be demonstrably true, even as some countries, most notably the US, which has entirely abandoned the WHO, have ignored that evidence. The closure, and I'm American, so I can say these things about the US. The closure of the United States Agency for International Development, an organization I worked with for many years, heralded by Elon Musk's bragging that he had fed the agency to the wood chipper, as one of the first achievements of his brainchild, which has been called Doge, was breathtaking in its suddenness, its completeness, and its cruelty. I used to work for USAID as a consultant in the Horn of Africa, and the work that it has done in the 60-plus years that it was in action has been remarkable. Not necessarily my work, but it just brought me into a kind of front row seat to the amazing work that was being done by people who are really career civil servants in that space. As with any government agency, it could always benefit from reform, but shuttering it completely, with hardly any public outcry, revealed a government that did not understand the significance of the soft power of diplomacy and a citizenry that was too focused on its own challenges to look beyond its borders. And that had been told, and the citizenry had been told or misled, that these challenges that they were facing were at least in part the result of historically wasting money on international engagements that brought no benefit to the US. So that's the kind of myth that people were fed. The irony of the critique, of this kind of critique of USAID, was that the critique was that it was being run by left-wing, so-called un-American types. And that contrasts sharply with another critique that had been very prevalent through many, many years, leveled at USAID, that it was too much focused, actually, on US interests, that it insisted on conditionalities that challenged the sovereignty and political autonomy of recipient countries, that it was, in effect, too much the arm of the US government, not enough, as was ultimately claimed. Already before the closure of USAID, the US's dominance in the aid space was being challenged by so-called non-traditional partners, most notably China, which sought commercial partners without any political conditionalities, but also Turkey, the Gulf countries, and others who did not insist on recipient countries agreeing to the economic and political terms of large loans or grants. But the closure of USAID set off a domino effect of similar, though less spectacular, aid cuts and other kinds of cuts. The US insisted that European countries should pay for their own security and protection, pulling significant funding away from NATO. Again, while security finance was certainly in need of reform, this kind of sudden and forced change sent states scurrying to try to pull funds from elsewhere within their national budgets to meet security bills. In the UK, where there's been a legally mandated commitment to dedicate 0.7% of the budget since 2015 to overseas development assistance, and where the budget had already been reduced at the beginning of this decade to 0.5%, it's now, this year, will be reduced to 0.3% in order to free up funds to be redirected towards security obligations. Similar dynamics are being felt throughout NATO member states, and I'm sure many of the countries that you come from, this will not be a particular surprise. The cut in aid budgets may be the most stark, but it's not the only way in which this global retraction, if you like, or the global reordering, to be more kind, can be seen. Foreign affairs ministries are tightening their belts and cutting staff and programs. The Paris Climate Accords have been derailed, as have the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN, which despite its challenges has been respected as an instrument of global governance since its founding at the end of World War II, is now at its weakest point, with unilateral actions being taken outside the authority of the Security Council. Given all these changes, this pretty grim picture that I've just painted, and which I think in present company it may be safe to call negative developments, why am I suggesting now is a really excellent time for you all to be joining the ranks of diplomacy and international development? So first, I think the changes that are going on now are truly unprecedented, as overused as that term is. And whether we're shifting to a multipolar world, witnessing the rise of China or the middle powers, we need to be watching, studying, discussing, and engaging in the changes that are taking place. We need to be tracking how these changes are experienced in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, South America, North America, Europe, Australia, and frankly, Antarctica. Not to mention space, which is a subject of a totally other subject, but another talk, but very interesting, and the competitions for access to space are essentially part of this whole question as well. We need to follow, report on, and educate ourselves, our colleagues, our public audiences about what is happening, not only from the places where these cuts and retractions are taking place, but from the places where they are being felt. How is South Africa or Tanzania's healthcare system impacted by the loss of funding for healthcare, including crucial HIV/AIDS treatment? How is food security impacted? Of course, I'm looking at that. How many people have lost their jobs? How many people cannot access services? And how are they coping, or are they not coping? Beyond the direct impacts of budget cuts, there are enormous secondary impacts on local and national economies. I was recently in Nairobi, and a friend of mine who's a taxi driver who I've known for a decade was asking him, how is business? And he said that his business has been cut in half by people losing their jobs, leaving the country, and a complete collapse in tourism. Restaurants, shops, people providing services, they've all been impacted. So there's a ripple effect that goes on far beyond the immediate subjects of the cuts. This knowledge about what the impacts are and what they look like from the perspective of so-called Global South countries is crucial. In some cases, this information has already been useful in rolling back the worst of the cuts. As much as 50% of the U.S.'s support for some forms of international aid has been restored and is now being implemented through the U.S. State Department. This happened after intense lobbying and education showed what the impact of the initial total cuts was, and we need more of this. Second, for those of you working in diplomacy, understanding how alignments are shifting around the world is essential. As the U.S. has vacated the international stage as a funder and an assistance provider, but sadly not as a sponsor of wars, questions have inevitably arisen about what comes next. Some have suggested that China is looking to fill the shoes that the U.S. has stepped out of. Be interested to hear what our president thinks about that question. I've been in China 3 times over the last 2 years, and I've been really interested to speak to people on the streets and in the cafes about what they think about that question. For the most part, they insist that China really has no interest in becoming the U.S. 2.0. True, China has become more outward-looking. They've designated what they call area studies as a Tier 1 subject, which means that it is being more generously funded and developed. And for a school like SOAS, we're the School of Oriental and African Studies, we're essentially a university that specializes in area studies. We've been doing a lot of kind of advising and linking up with trying to kind of help guide some of the universities in China to think about how to do area studies in a way that is not reproducing the lessons of the colonial era, but tries to jump in at a much more equitable kind of phase. So there's that kind of thing going on. China sees the Belt and Road Initiative as holding great promise for its future prosperity. But for them, and apologies to any Chinese friends in the room who may have a different perspective, and I would love to hear them in the Q&A if you like. Global engagement for China is much more about forging commercial and economic ties. They don't expect China to take on a major new role as a humanitarian or development assistance funder. They also do not expect that China will seek to exert very much political leverage over its international partners. So where will political leadership come from? It may be helpful here to look at humanitarian assistance to get some perspective on this question. So historically, in the sort of humanitarian sphere, there's been a global understanding that in responding to crises, the U.S. could be expected to provide about 1/3 of all funding. The EU would provide another third, and then the final third would be made up of contributions from everyone else in the world. And that formula has obviously been thrown out the window now. In many development circles, there has been quite a lot of discussion and debate about how to bring about meaningful localization, ownership of development processes by those who are its subjects, accountability for donors and delivery agents of development, and participation in development at all levels. But what we're seeing now as this whole realignment happens is what a really brilliant young Ethiopian scholar named Mekele Bayene has called localization by abandonment. People are left to fend for themselves, to make ends meet without the resources to do so. Is that really what localization should be? Perhaps what we're seeing is a global realignment that does not follow the lines of who engages in development and development aid the most. In that case, perhaps China will become an economic powerhouse, even if development is not part of its internationalization strategy. We'll have to wait and see. And what of the middle powers? Canada, India, Brazil, Turkey, will they take advantage of their sheer number and collective economic and political power to exert leadership on the international stage? This might be the best outcome for the United Nations, which is fighting for its survival right now. What would the end of the United Nations look like as an instrument of governance? We would likely see more unilateral actions and actions undertaken by groups of countries motivated by their own geopolitical interests, global action on challenges that we all face: climate change, conflict, gender inequity, poverty and inequality, and health crises would be much harder to mobilize and coordinate. Last year at SOAS, we gave an honorary degree to an alumna, SOAS alumna. She'd done a master's degree in Near East Studies, and she'd worked for USAID for 40 years. Her name is Elizabeth Kvitashvili. She was the first Georgian American, by Georgia I mean the country of Georgia, rather than the state. She was the first Georgian American diplomat in the US, and she ran USAID offices in Russia, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, and many other places. And I met her working in the late 1990s in Ethiopia, as we were all engaged in trying to prevent a famine between 1999 and 2000. So I wanted to share with you a few of the observations that she made about this question of what's happening in the world, because I have always learned a lot from her, and I thought I would share them with you. I must say, her speech was shorter than this one. It was 3 minutes. We made her speak for 3 minutes. So I will just take a couple of the key notes that she gave us. But one is that she reminded us of two things. First, that people who do the kind of work that our students do and that Sarah's students do too don't do it because of the good job prospects or the salary. You do it because you're passionate and interested and engaged in the world, because you care about what happens in the world and want to be part of making it a better place. Second, she reminded us that the arc of history is long, and that just as it has moved towards protection and isolationism, it will eventually move in the other direction, as we realize that we need each other, that turning inward hurts us as much as it hurts others, and that our survival depends on us coming together. Elizabeth was one of the best and most dedicated public servants, and for that's really what diplomacy is, it's public service. And so I think it's really fitting to share those reflections here. It's for these reasons that I argue that there's never been a more important time to study, research, and work and engage with these dynamics. The social, political, and economic challenges that we are experiencing now will transform what we understand as developmental processes, how they happen, who controls them, and who benefits from them. Our engagement with development might need to change, and some would argue that change is long overdue, but it's really no time to look away. Beyond studying the changes we're living through now, I hope that you use your knowledge, insights, and ability to think critically about key challenges in the world and to work for positive change. Development and diplomacy are fields that, unlike other kinds of fields, like I studied anthropology, I was told to observe and not change anything, observe and withdraw from the field in a sense. But development and diplomacy are fields that are really unapologetic about wanting to make the world a better place, about using politics and communication and research and action to generate understanding and cooperation and momentum towards positive outcomes for all, not just for the few. So I hope that, as you move away from CERIS, you'll continue to ask critical questions, to challenge injustice, to work for a better world for all, and to use the incredible privilege that you've been given to work in this field and to study, as you have in a place like this, to generate positive change. This new world that we are entering needs you more than ever before. So thank you, and congratulations once more.